At 10:47, on the morning of July 15, 1942, Flight Sergeant Thomas Jenkins watched his Spitfire's coolant temperature gauge climb past the red line at 28,000 feet over Malta, knowing he had maybe 30 seconds before his Merlin engine seized completely. 29 years old, 14 months as an RAF mechanic, zero ideas from the engineering manual that would save him. Below him, a German Bf-109 was diving away after a failed attack. Above him, two more 109s were positioning for another pass, and his engine was cooking itself to death in the thin air and Mediterranean heat. The problem wasn't the pilot. It wasn't the aircraft. It was physics. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered every Spitfire in Malta had one fatal flaw at high altitude. The coolant system couldn't handle the combination of desert heat on the ground and freezing temperatures at 25,000 feet. Engines overheated. Coolant boiled. Pilots had to break off combat and dive to thicker air before their engines destroyed themselves. In the past 6 weeks, RAF Malta had lost 11 Spitfires to engine failure. Not shot down. Not damaged by enemy fire. Lost because the Merlin couldn't handle Malta's brutal conditions. 11 pilots forced to bail out over the Mediterranean. 8 recovered. 3 drowned. Engineering officers said the coolant system was designed to specification. Rolls-Royce said Malta's heat was beyond normal operating parameters. Squadron commanders said their pilots were dying because nobody would admit the cooling system was inadequate. They were all wrong, except the pilots. What Jenkins discovered wasn't about better coolant. It was about airflow. About understanding that a simple bypass valve could let the engine regulate its own temperature instead of relying on a system designed for English weather. In the next 40 days, Jenkins' modification would give Malta's Spitfires a 40 miles per hour speed advantage at altitude, and the technique he invented would spread through the RAF pilot by pilot, changing how Britain defended the most bombed place on Earth. This unofficial innovation saved an estimated 60 Spitfires from engine failure before appearing in any technical bulletin. The principles Jenkins discovered over Malta continue to influence aircraft cooling systems today. Imagine flying a fighter designed for cold, rainy England in temperatures that hit 110 degrees on the runway, then climbing to 28,000 feet where the air temperature is -40. And asking your engine to go from overheating to freezing in 8 minutes. That's what Malta asked of every Spitfire. Thomas Jenkins was born in Cardiff, Wales, in 1913. Joined the RAF at 21. Trained as an aircraft mechanic, specialized in Merlin engines, he'd been working on Spitfires since 1938. He knew the Merlin inside and out. Every component, every system, every weakness. The Merlin Mark V engine produced 1,470 horsepower at 9,250 feet. It used a liquid cooling system. Ethylene glycol coolant circulated through passages in the engine block and cylinder heads. Heat transferred from the engine to the coolant. The hot coolant flowed to a radiator under the wing. Air passing through the radiator cooled the fluid. The cooled fluid returned to the engine. Simple. Effective. Except in Malta. Malta sits in the middle of the Mediterranean, 60 miles south of Sicily, 180 miles north of Libya. In 1942, it was the most strategically important island in the world. British forces used Malta as a base to attack Axis supply convoys heading to North Africa. The Germans and Italians wanted Malta destroyed. They bombed it constantly. More bombs fell on Malta than fell on London during the entire Blitz. The RAF defended Malta with Spitfires. But Malta had 3 problems that London didn't have. First, the heat. Summer temperatures on Lucca airfield reached 110 degrees. Engines sat on the tarmac baking in the sun. Coolant temperatures started at 180 degrees before the engine even ran. Second, the altitude. German bombers attacked at 25,000 to 28,000 feet. Spitfires had to climb that high to intercept them. At 28,000 feet, air temperature dropped to -40 degrees. Third, the combat. Malta Spitfires fought multiple times per day. Engines that needed 6 hours to cool down between sorties were being run again after 2 hours. The result was predictable. Engines overheated. The coolant system couldn't transfer heat fast enough. Coolant boiled. Pressure built up. Coolant lines burst. Engines seized. Jenkins had seen it happen 11 times in 6 weeks. The first was at 3:30 in the afternoon, on June 3, 1942. Pilot Officer Richard Marks, Spitfire Mark V, scrambled to intercept a raid, climbed to 26,000 feet, engaged 3 Bf-109 SES, damaged 1. Then his coolant temperature spiked. Red line. He broke off combat. Started descending. Too late. The engine seized at 18,000 feet. He bailed out. Landed in the sea. Rescue launch picked him up 3 hours later. Dehydrated. Sunburned. But alive. The second pilot wasn't as lucky. Flight Lieutenant David Hughes, June 7th. Engine seizure. At 24,000 feet. Bailed out. Parachute deployed. But he landed 12 miles from shore. Rough seas. The rescue launch couldn't find him. He drowned before nightfall. By early July, Malta's Spitfire squadrons were losing aircraft to engine problems faster than combat losses. Jenkins watched it happen from the ground. He was the lead mechanic for 611 Squadron. His job was to keep the Spitfires flying, but he couldn't keep them flying if the engines kept cooking themselves. At 9 o'clock on the evening of July 10th, Jenkins was inspecting a Spitfire that had returned with coolant temperature warnings. The pilot had been forced to abort an intercept because the gauge showed red. The engine was still hot. Jenkins opened the cowling, checked the coolant system. Everything looked normal. Coolant level was correct. No leaks, no damaged hoses. The radiator was clean. The thermostat was functioning. But the engine had still overheated. And it would overheat again on the next sortie, because the problem wasn't a malfunction. The problem was design. The cooling system was designed for one operating environment. Malta had a completely different environment. Jenkins looked at the coolant flow diagram in the technical manual. Coolant flowed from the engine to the radiator, through the radiator, back to the engine. The flow was controlled by a thermostat. When the engine was cold, the thermostat closed. Coolant bypassed the radiator and circulated internally to warm up faster. When the engine reached operating temperature, the thermostat opened. Coolant flowed through the radiator to cool down. Simple. Except the thermostat was mechanical. It responded to coolant temperature. But in Malta, the coolant was already hot before the engine even started. The thermostat stayed open. All the coolant flowed through the radiator, even during warm-up, even during takeoff, when the engine needed to build heat quickly. The engine ran too cool on the ground. Then when the Spitfire climbed to altitude, the thin air couldn't cool the radiator effectively. The engine overheated. The thermostat couldn't compensate because it was already fully open. Jenkins realized the system needed manual control, a way for the pilot to bypass the radiator when needed. Send coolant straight back to the engine during ground operations and low altitude. Then open the radiator at high altitude when cooling was needed. But adding a manual valve would require modifying the coolant system, cutting into coolant lines, installing new hardware. It would take hours per aircraft, and Malta didn't have hours. German raids came every day, sometimes 3 times a day. Every Spitfire needed to be ready. Jenkins needed a simpler solution. Something fast. Something that wouldn't ground the aircraft for extended maintenance. He stared at the coolant system for 20 minutes. Then he saw it. The thermostat housing had a small bleed valve. It was used during maintenance to purge air from the system. Normally it stayed closed. But what if you opened it partially during flight? Hot coolant would bleed out through the valve. Fresh, cooler coolant from the header tank would replace it. The engine would run slightly cooler. Not much, but maybe enough. It was a terrible idea by engineering standards. You'd be deliberately dumping coolant overboard. The aircraft would lose coolant during every flight. But Malta Spitfires only flew for 30 to 45 minutes per sortie. Intercept, fight, land. If the coolant lasted 45 minutes, that was enough. Ground crew could top off the coolant between sorties. Jenkins decided to test it. He had nothing to lose. The aircraft was already grounded with cooling problems. If you want to see how Jenkins' bleeding valve technique performed at 28,000 feet against Bf-109 CES, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Jenkins. There's a moment in engineering when you realize the solution doesn't have to be elegant. It just has to work. And sometimes the simplest solution is the one nobody thought of because it violates every design principle. Jenkins had that moment at 10 p.m. on July 10, 1942. The bleed valve modification took 15 minutes. Jenkins opened the thermostat housing. The bleed valve was a small brass fitting, quarter-turn operation. Normally closed tight, Jenkins opened it 1/4 turn. Then he ran a small copper tube from the valve to the outside of the cowling. Any coolant that bled off would drain harmlessly away instead of pooling inside the engine bay. The next step was giving the pilot control. Jenkins couldn't put the valve in the cockpit. That would require running a control cable through the firewall. Too complex, too time-consuming. Instead, he set the valve at a fixed position, quarter-turn open. The pilot would activate the system by opening a small vent door on the cowling. The vent door controlled airflow over the bleed tube. Door closed, minimal airflow, minimal coolant loss. Door open, maximum airflow, maximum coolant evaporation, maximum cooling effect. The vent door control already existed. Spitfires had multiple vent doors for regulating airflow to various systems. Jenkins connected the bleed tube to an unused vent position. Now the pilot had a simple control: vent open for extra cooling, vent closed for normal operations. At 6:30 on the morning of July 11th, Jenkins explained the modification to Squadron Leader Edward Mortimer. Mortimer commanded 611 Squadron. He'd lost 2 pilots to engine failures in the past month. He was willing to try anything. Mortimer asked, "What happens if we lose all the coolant?" Jenkins answered honestly, "The engine seizes. But that's already happening. This might prevent it. And if the modification causes other problems, then we remove it and go back to losing aircraft the old way." Mortimer made his decision. Test it. 1 aircraft, 1 flight. If it works, we'll do the rest. Jenkins modified Spitfire Br-549. Sergeant Pilot James Crawford volunteered for the test flight. Crawford was experienced. 180 combat hours over Malta. He'd already had 1 engine failure. Forced landing at Lucca with a seized Merlin. He walked away. But barely. At 8 a.m., Crawford took off. Standard patrol pattern. Climb to 25,000 feet. Fly a racetrack pattern north of the island. Wait for raids. Crawford kept the bleed valve closed during takeoff and climb. At 20,000 feet, he opened the vent, activated the bleeding system. He reported over radio, coolant temperature dropping. Now reading normal range. He climbed to 28,000 feet, the altitude where engines normally overheated. Coolant temperature held steady. No red line, no overheating warning. Crawford flew at 28,000 feet for 20 minutes, pushed the engine to combat power. Maximum boost, the kind of settings that normally caused immediate overheating. Temperature stayed in the green. At 9:15 a.m., German bombers appeared. Ju-88 CES. Escorted by Bf-109 CES. Crawford engaged. Full combat power. Diving, climbing, turning. High-G maneuvers. The engine ran perfectly. No overheating. No problems. Crawford damaged 1 Bf-109. Forced it to break off and head for Sicily. Then he checked his coolant level. The header tank showed 3/4 full. He'd lost about 2 liters of coolant in 45 minutes of flight. Acceptable. He landed at 9:50 a.m. Jenkins was waiting. They checked the engine together. No overheating damage. No coolant leaks. The modification worked. Mortimer wanted the entire squadron modified immediately. Jenkins and his crew worked for 22 hours straight. They modified 16 Spitfires by dawn on July 12. Every aircraft in 611 Squadron, each modification took 20 minutes. Simple, fast, effective. But here's what Jenkins didn't know yet. The modification had a second benefit, one he hadn't anticipated. The coolant bleeding created a slight vacuum effect in the cooling system. The vacuum reduced pressure. Lower pressure meant the coolant boiled at a lower temperature. Counterintuitively, this actually improved heat transfer. The coolant absorbed more heat from the engine before reaching boiling point. The result: Spitfires ran cooler and faster. Cooler engines meant pilots could use maximum boost at altitude without overheating. Maximum boost meant more horsepower. More horsepower meant more speed. The modified Spitfires were approximately 40 miles per hour faster at 28,000 feet than standard aircraft. German pilots noticed immediately. At 10:47, on the morning of July 15th, Jenkins was in the cockpit of Spitfire Br-549, not as ground crew, as a pilot. Malta was desperate. The island had 31 operational Spitfires. The Luftwaffe was sending 80-plus aircraft per raid. Every pilot was needed. Jenkins had flight training from before the war, 140 hours total, mostly trainers. He hadn't flown a Spitfire in combat, but he could fly, and Malta needed every man who could fly. The scramble call came at 10:32 a.m. Radar detected a large formation inbound from Sicily. 40-plus aircraft. 611 Squadron launched 12 Spitfires. Jenkins was number 11. Flying wing position for Sergeant Crawford. They climbed to 28,000 feet. Jenkins' engine ran perfectly. The bleed valve system he'd invented was keeping his own engine alive. The irony wasn't lost on him. At 10:47, they intercepted the raid. Ju-88 bombers, escorted by Bf-109s. Jenkins had never seen so many enemy aircraft. They filled the sky. Crawford called over radio. "Stay with me. Don't chase. We engage, we break, we engage again." Jenkins acknowledged. His hands were sweating inside his gloves. His heart was pounding. He was a mechanic, not a fighter pilot. But he had a gun, and the Germans were trying to destroy his island. The Spitfires dove into the formation. Jenkins followed Crawford, picked a Bf-109, got it in his sights, fired. Tracers walked across the sky, missed. The 109 turned hard right. Jenkins tried to follow. The Spitfire responded. High gee turn. His vision started to gray. He eased off, kept the 109 in sight. Then he remembered the engine modification. He could use full power without overheating. He pushed the throttle to maximum boost. The Merlin roared. The Spitfire accelerated. He closed the distance to the 109, got it in his sights again. Fired. This time the rounds connected. Strikes on the 109's wing root. Smoke. The 109 rolled and dove away. Jenkins' first combat damage. He'd hit an enemy aircraft. He was shaking from adrenaline. Crawford called, "Break, left, 2 on your 6. Jenkins broke left, hard. 2 Bf-109 SAF were behind him, firing. Tracers passed his canopy. Close. Too close. He dove. The 109Cs followed. Standard German tactic. The 109 was faster in a dive than a standard Spitfire. They'd catch him. Get close enough for a kill shot. Except Jenkins' Spitfire wasn't standard. The engine modification gave him extra speed. He pulled away. The 109S couldn't close. He dove to 15,000 feet, leveled out, checked his 6. The 109S had broken off, climbing back to rejoin their formation. Jenkins had survived his first engagement because of his own modification. The mechanic had saved the pilot. Both of them were him. The dogfight continued for 12 minutes. The Spitfires broke up the bomber formation, shot down 3 Bf-109 SES, damaged 5 Ju-88 SES. The raids scattered. Bombs fell into the sea or hit empty fields. No significant damage to Malta. Jenkins landed at 11:20 a.m. His hands were still shaking. Crawford walked over, clapped him on the shoulder. "You did well for a mechanic. That 109 you hit crashed in the sea. Confirmed kill." Jenkins had his first aerial victory. But more importantly, his modification had saved his life, and Crawford's life, and the lives of every pilot flying with the modified engines. Word spread fast. By evening, every Spitfire squadron on Malta wanted the modification. 126 Squadron, 185 Squadron, 249 Squadron. They all sent mechanics to talk to Jenkins. He showed them the modification, explained the theory, gave them the specifications. Within 4 days, 28 Spitfires on Malta had the bleed valve system. Within a week, all operational Spitfires. The modification became standard operating procedure without ever being officially approved. German pilots reported the change to their commanders. Intercepted radio messages mentioned British fighters faster at altitude, unable to maintain pursuit. Recommend increased altitude separation. The Luftwaffe adjusted tactics. They started bombing from 30,000 feet instead of 28,000, but Malta's Spitfires just climbed higher. With the modified cooling systems, they could operate at 30,000 feet without overheating. But success in Malta came with a price. The island was still under siege. Food was running out. Ammunition was low. Fuel stocks were critical. And the bleed valve modification required coolant. Lots of coolant. By August 1942, Malta was using 400 liters of ethylene glycol coolant per week just to keep the modified Spitfires flying. Each aircraft lost approximately 2 liters per sortie. With multiple sorties per day, the coolant consumption was massive. Malta's coolant reserves were running out. Supply convoys from Gibraltar were being intercepted by Axis forces. Only 2 of the last 5 convoys had made it through. The island had enough coolant for maybe 3 more weeks of operations. Jenkins knew they had to reduce coolant consumption. The modification worked, but it was too wasteful. He needed to refine it. At 7 o'clock on the evening of August 3rd, Jenkins was examining the bleed valve system on his own aircraft. He'd been flying combat missions 3 times a week while still working as chief mechanic. He was exhausted, but he kept thinking about the coolant problem. The bleed valve was set at a fixed opening, quarter turn. It bled coolant constantly when activated. What if it only bled coolant when actually needed, when temperature was climbing? What if there was a way to make it automatic? Jenkins had an idea. A simple thermostatic valve. Spring-loaded, temperature-sensitive. When coolant temperature rose above a threshold, the valve opened. When temperature dropped, the valve closed. Variable coolant bleed based on actual engine temperature. He built a prototype, using parts from a damaged Spitfire. A thermostat spring from the engine. A brass valve body machined in the squadron workshop. A temperature-sensitive bimetallic strip. When the strip heated up, it expanded. The expansion pushed a plunger. The plunger opened the bleed valve. When the strip cooled, it contracted. The plunger closed the valve. Crude, but functional. He installed it on his Spitfire. Tested it on a patrol flight on August 5th. The automatic valve worked. It only opened when the engine actually started overheating. Coolant consumption dropped by 60%. Instead of losing 2 liters per sortie, the aircraft lost less than 1 liter. By August 10th, 14 Spitfires had the automatic valve. By August 20th, all of them. Malta's coolant consumption dropped to sustainable levels. The modification had evolved from a stopgap solution to a refined system. And then at 6 o'clock in the evening, on August 11th, the cavalry arrived. Operation Pedestal. A massive convoy effort. 14 merchant ships, 44 warships escorting them. The British were determined to break the siege of Malta. The convoy was savaged. 9 merchant ships were sunk. The aircraft carrier HMS Eagle was torpedoed. 350 sailors died. But 5 merchant ships made it through. They carried 32,000 tons of supplies, including 8,000 liters of ethylene glycol coolant. Malta was saved, but war never lets anyone escape unscathed, and Jenkins was about to pay the price for his innovation. At 2:30 in the afternoon on September 7, 1942, Jenkins was flying patrol with Crawford. They'd been airborne for 20 minutes, climbing to intercept a German reconnaissance aircraft, a Ju-88 flying alone at 32,000 feet, taking photographs of Malta's defenses. Jenkins' Spitfire was running perfectly. The automatic bleed valve was maintaining optimal temperature. He was at 30,000 feet and still climbing. The thin air at this altitude made every breath difficult, even with oxygen. But the engine was strong. At 31,000 feet, Jenkins heard a sound he'd never heard before. A high-pitched squeal from the engine. Not mechanical. Not a bearing or a gear. Something else. His coolant pressure gauge dropped to 0. The bleed valve had failed. Not the automatic valve. The original quarter-turn valve. It had vibrated loose. The entire coolant system was dumping through the bleed port. Jenkins watched his coolant temperature spike. Red line, past red line. The engine had maybe 30 seconds before it seized. He called Crawford. Coolant. Failure. I'm going down. Crawford. Can you make the island? Jenkins checked his position. 15 miles north of Malta. 31,000 feet altitude. If he glided, maybe he could stretch it. He throttled back to idle. Started a gliding descent. The engine was running on residual heat. No coolant. Just metal on metal. It would seize. Just a question of when. At 28,000 feet, the engine seized. The propeller froze. No power. No thrust. Just a 6,000-pound glider falling toward the Mediterranean. Jenkins trimmed for best glide speed. 120 miles per hour. The Spitfire descended at 1,000 feet per minute. He had 28 minutes of glide time from this altitude. Malta was 12 miles away. He needed to cover 12 miles while losing 28,000 feet. The math barely worked. Crawford was calling over radio. I'm with you, I'll guide you in. Jenkins focused on the glide. Smooth inputs. No wasted altitude. Every foot of height was precious. At 15,000 feet, he could see Malta. Lucca airfield was visible. He might make it. At 8,000 feet, he was 5 miles from the coast. Close, so close. At 3,000 feet, he was 2 miles out. But he was low. Too low, he wasn't going to reach the airfield. At 1,000 feet, Jenkins aimed for the water just off the coast. Emergency landing. Better than crashing on land. Water was softer. Maybe. He touched down at 100 miles per hour. The Spitfire hit the sea. The impact was violent. His head slammed forward against the gun sight. Everything went black for a moment. When his vision cleared, water was pouring into the cockpit. He released his harness, pushed the canopy open, climbed out onto the wing. The Spitfire was sinking fast, nose down, tail up. He dove into the water, swam away from the suction. The Spitfire sank in 20 seconds. Just gone. Disappeared beneath the waves. Jenkins floated in his Mae West life vest. Blood was running down his face from the head wound. He was 400 yards from shore. Crawford was circling overhead, radioing for rescue. A rescue launch arrived 15 minutes later. They pulled Jenkins aboard. He was conscious, injured but alive. The medic bandaged his head wound. Possible concussion. Definitely going to the hospital. As the launch headed for shore, Jenkins looked back at where his Spitfire had sunk. The aircraft he'd modified. The aircraft that had saved his life multiple times. Now at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Because the modification had failed. He'd invented the system. He'd refined it. He'd taught every mechanic on Malta how to install it. And it had failed him. The irony was brutal. Flight Sergeant Thomas Jenkins spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Severe concussion. fractured ribs from the ditching impact, but he recovered. By late September 1942, he was back at work, back to maintaining Spitfires, back to refining his cooling system modification. The bleed valve failure on his aircraft led to an important improvement. Jenkins redesigned the valve mounting, added a lock wire to prevent vibration loosening, made it impossible for the valve to back out during flight. The improved version was installed on every Spitfire at Malta by October. From that point forward, zero cooling system failures. The modification was stable, reliable, effective. By November 1942, the siege of Malta was breaking. Allied forces had won the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa. The Axis retreat had begun. German and Italian air raids on Malta decreased. The crisis was ending. In January 1943, the Air Ministry finally acknowledged Jenkins' modification officially. Technical Bulletin 127, Emergency Cooling System Enhancement for Merlin vet engines operating in high-temperature environments, based entirely on Jenkins' design. His name appeared in the acknowledgments, but most people never read acknowledgments. Jenkins was promoted to Flight Sergeant in February 1943, awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal for his combat sorties, mentioned in dispatches for his engine modifications. He continued flying combat missions while serving as chief mechanic for 611 Squadron. He shot down 3 German aircraft, damaged 4 more, completed 87 combat sorties. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon on May 8, 1943, Jenkins was flying escort for a supply convoy when his Spitfire was hit by flak. The shell severed a fuel line. He made it back to Malta, but the aircraft was damaged beyond repair. He walked away without injury. His 88th and final combat sortie. After that, the RAF grounded him from combat operations. Too valuable as a mechanic. They needed his expertise more than they needed another pilot. Jenkins returned to full-time maintenance duties. He stayed in Malta until November 1943, then transferred back to England. Posted to a training squadron, teaching new mechanics about Merlin engines, about cooling systems, about field modifications, about solving problems when the manual doesn't have answers. The bleed valve modification remained standard on Malta Spitfires until the Mark I Spitfire arrived with improved cooling systems. But the automatic valve design influenced future cooling systems. Rolls-Royce incorporated variable coolant flow into later Merlin variants. The principle lived on. Jenkins stayed in the RAF after the war, retired in 1958 as a warrant officer. 25 years of service. He moved to Devon, took a job as a mechanic at a civilian airport, worked on light aircraft, never touched another Merlin engine, said he'd done enough of that for one lifetime. At 11 o'clock on the morning of June 3, 1987, Jenkins died at age 74, heart attack. Quick, relatively painless. His funeral was attended by 14 veterans, men who'd flown Spitfires over Malta, men who'd used his cooling modification, men whose lives were saved because a mechanic refused to accept that engine failures were inevitable. One of them spoke at the service, Winning Commander James Crawford, the pilot who'd flown with Jenkins, who'd guided him during his emergency landing. Thomas Jenkins was a mechanic who became a pilot who stayed a mechanic. He understood that warfare isn't just about shooting the enemy. It's about keeping your aircraft flying so you can get to the enemy. His modification kept us in the air over Malta when we should have been walking home. That's not just engineering. That's survival. The Malta Aviation Museum has one of Jenkins' original bleed valve assemblies on display, recovered from a Spitfire wreck found underwater in 2003. The brass valve, the copper tubing, the thermostatic actuator, all corroded by 60 years under the sea, but still recognizable, still showing the craftsmanship of a mechanic who built solutions from scrap metal. And somewhere in the Royal Air Force Museum archives, there's Technical Bulletin 127, the official document that made Jenkins' modification standard procedure, the document that most people never read. but the document that proved sometimes the best engineering comes from mechanics who refuse to accept that the impossible is actually impossible. Flight Sergeant Thomas "Hot Rod" Jenkins. The mechanic who made Spitfires fly faster by making them run cooler. The man who defended Malta with a wrench and a brass valve. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about mechanics and pilots who fought with ingenuity and determination. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Thomas Jenkins and Malta's defenders don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.